Hello there. As students, we spend a lot of time studying. In fact, sometimes it seems like that's all we do. However, it also seems like studying ends when we graduate, and I'm afraid to tell you that that isn't true. Studying and learning is a lifelong human endeavor. As an educator, or rather any professional really, whether that's education, law, or counseling, you just use 3 examples, there is a continuing education requirement. For educators, the start of every year you will have in-services designed to bring you up to speed on the changing legal aspect of your job and any new methodologies that your district wants you to implement that are backed up by recent research. As a lawyer, again, the laws change, and you can't successfully defend a client or prosecute anyone if you don't know the appropriate law. And as a counselor, you have those continuing education requirements to keep your license up to date and to learn new techniques like EMDR, or eye movement reprocessing and desensitization. And so it's important to be able to study well. And so in light of that, let's take a look at a 50-plus page monstrosity I got to read in a teaching class last semester. And while I good-naturedly poke fun at the professor who assigned this reading for giving us something in so much depth when really, as a practical sense, you don't really need to know exactly why the techniques work the best, just that they are the best. And I think a lot of the benefit that comes from knowing all the detail is wasted in terms of learning techniques, but that being able to go into that much detail on something was perhaps the most useful part of going into that much depth. And so I'm going to go ahead and swap the angle here and go take a look at one of these documents, or rather one of the tables from these documents. And so if we look here, you'll see that I pulled out table 4. This is right at the end of the article, and I'll have the article linked down below. It's the publisher's website, so you may or may not be able to access it there, but you will get access to the title, which should let you access it through your university library or through Google Scholar. Now, this first column you see shows the technique being used, whether that's summarization or rereading or practice testing. The columns that the rows that correspond with it just tell us more about each of those, or each of the techniques. The only column we're really going to pay attention to is the one titled utility. And so we see that a lot of techniques are not very useful. They're rated as low utility by the authors of this article, which essentially means that they're useful in specific areas, or they don't really have much of an effect. They don't really help you very much. And so it's sort of frustrating to see that things like summarization and highlighting, some of the most common techniques you see in middle and high school, are actually considered low utility. They aren't very useful in very many areas, and they don't actually help you all that much. When we look at the next subset, the moderate usefulness, we see things like self-explanation or interleaved practice, which may have some utility, certainly more than summarizing and highlighting, but are not exceptional techniques. The 2 exceptional techniques, as defined by this meta-analysis, are practice testing and distributed practice. And since these are the 2 techniques that I relied on exclusively, well, almost exclusively, there may have been times when I slipped into other techniques of these, but most of, if not all of my studying for each of my tests was comprised of distributed practice and practice testing. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at those. Well, I think practice testing is this way. Nope, this is distributed practice. So we'll talk about distributed practice first. So with distributed practice, this graph is showing us 3 different trajectories. The first trajectory, according to our legend, is our black circle where we have 0 days between sessions. The gray box is when we have 1 day between sessions, and the white triangles when we have 30 days between each of our sessions, or our study sessions, I should clarify that. On our x-axis, we have the number of sessions, and you can see that these have 4 or 5 sessions. And then we also have a final test after 30 days. And then our y-axis just shows the proportion of questions answered correctly. So we can see that after session number 2, our best performing modality is 0 days between sessions. We're answering approximately 80% of the questions correctly. After session 3, it's up to 90. I'd say that by session 4, it's up to about 95, and then it sort of plateaus and doesn't progress any further. For our 1 day, these gray squares, we see that we begin maybe at 53% of questions answered correctly after session 2. But then we see a large jump after session 3 when we're entering maybe 83%. By session 4, we're almost up to where we were with 0 days between sessions. And then we see that we have exceeded the proportion correct, or the percentage of questions answered correctly, by session 6. For our white triangles, the 30 days between sessions, we see that session 2, we only remember about 20% of the material. But by session 3, we're up to about 48%, it looks like. Session 4, we're all the way up into the 70s now. And then we sort of plateau just shy of 80 around sessions 5 and 6. Now, this may make it seem that if you have little time, have no days between study sessions, but if you have a good bit of time, take the 1 day between sessions, you end up a little bit better if you have 2 weeks to study, let's say. But that's not the whole story. Remember, we talked on the x-axis how we have final test after 30 days. So after 30 days of not studying, we come back and test the same material again. And we see that the order of our key has flipped. We see that 0 days, or circles, are the least effective at what looks to be around 67%. Our gray boxes are next at, let's say, 82%. And our triangles are the best at above 90% correct. And so as you're studying, it's important to spread out your studying, that the larger a gap you have between your study sessions, the longer the material will be with you. So perhaps that doesn't matter to you in a required class. Say you don't really care about anthropology, but you're forced to take it, or whatever the topic is. You could get by for the test by just doing study sessions, 1 every single day leading up to the test, and you'd be fine. However, if you're doing something like, say, studying for the bar, or learning to be a teacher, where those are techniques you're going to have to use on and off throughout your career, it might make sense to spread out those study sessions so that as you move from semester to the next, refresh yourself on what you learned the last semester so that you get this effect of maintaining your knowledge into the future, so that after 30 days pass, you're able to remember much more of it than if you had just studied for the test with cramming. Now, going back, let's take a look at practice testing. So practice testing is perhaps my favorite studying method. And one of the reasons it's helpful is that the easiest way to do this is with flashcards, or perhaps Quizlet or some other app, but I prefer the physical flashcards. This way, I get to study the material as I'm writing the cards, going through my notes, turning them into cards. I get to study again, which helps me just sort of with spaced practice of I wrote it down then, and now after a period of time, I'm coming back to it and writing it down, looking through everything. And then I get into the practice testing area of I get to look at the card and say, this is my clue word, what corresponds to it? Or if I flip it around, this is my answer, what is the clue word that goes with it? I found this very helpful. If you look at our x-axis, we have 2 different things. In larger font, we have the bottom third on baseline measure and the bottom third on baseline measure. So this sort of deals with an issue we see in research of, well, if you're taking a continuous measure, what really is the difference between someone who scores a 49 on a test and a 51 on a test? There's not much difference there. So by taking out the middle portion or the middle third, we see the top third and the bottom third, and we get a more distinct gap between them. We see that the top third scored better than the bottom third, regardless of the condition. But if we look at the smaller font portion of our x-axis, we see that we have a day delay versus week delay versus day delay versus week delay for our top third and bottom third categories. And then when we look at our y-axis, we see the final test performance percentage, with dark gray being with a practice test and light gray meaning no practice test, so just regular studying, with the regular studying techniques sort of varying based on which study in the meta-analysis was looking at. So maybe highlighting, maybe rereading. If you're really interested in knowing the fine detail on this, go ahead, check the link in the description to the article. So we see that top third does better than bottom third, regardless of practice test or not. But that in each category, with 1 day delay between the practice test and learning and a week delay between practice test and between practice test and the real test, we see that the practice test does better by what looks to be about 15 percentage points. And we see the same with our bottom third, that having the practice test improve performance on the test, regardless if it was a 1 day delay or a week delay. And while the week delay was a little bit worse than the day delay, it's still better than it would have been without the practice test. And I can't recommend these two techniques highly enough. They were very effective, and with enough time in terms of time leading up to the test so that you can space out your learning, and in time dedicated to learning within your sessions, you'll be able to succeed with these two techniques. So in light of that, I wish you the best of luck in any of your summer courses or the courses once fall comes around, and hopefully we move back into being able to have in-person, face-to-face classes. So until next time, cheers.